for the drums.
So last week with the mental model number 5, measures and aggregation, we looked at all of the theory. Now it's time to get real. I mean, we work with this thing day to day, and what I want to do is run a few things by you. So let me then just kind of like show you a little bit more about what I'm thinking. What we've got here is this Tableau query process. We've discussed that by and large, this is a massive simplification of what's really going on under the hood, because as you mentioned, Jonathan, it may not be that we have just one set of aggregate query results. We could have multiple marks cards, each at multiple levels of granularity. State is on one marks card, country is on the other. I'm going to get different aggregate query results for the different marks cards. This all then it kind of adds up to one of the things that you said really can make Tableau more difficult to work with, because for the analyst who say is working in Python, or the analyst who's working in Excel, they tend to have more of like a linear step-by-step kind of visible, tangible feedback of what's going on as they do step by step. I create a pivot table in Excel and I'm in a different sheet or I make a formula and I can see what happens as the result of every little thing that I do, or I make a for loop and I iterate through some records in Python to produce a data frame. Whatever it is, I'm kind of being very methodical about taking one step after the next. And yet inside of Tableau, all of these things can be something of a murky black box until you've watched this YouTube playlist.
Just for fun, capture the query logs from your data warehouse sometime when Tableau is chatting back and forth. That's a fun exercise. There's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on. Okay, so this is an oversimplification. What I'd like to do is kind of unpack a little bit more the aggregation things, the nuances of Tableau when we talk about what is aggregation, and just run by you a handful of scenarios and also kind of lay out some vocabulary. I use this term meaningless aggregation, and it may or may not be a term that resonates with you, but this is a scenario that I encounter and actually kind of create very purposely from time to time, because in a future mental model, we'll talk about how there's 4 levels of calculations. There's 4 levels at which calculations occur in Tableau. And it can often occur that I want to take a value that's a record level value, one of those observational values from the original data set, and just put it into an aggregate value. And so in my language, I call that a meaningless aggregation. I'd like to show you what I'm talking about here. Let's just pretend we've got this simple Superstore canvas, and there's one dimension in the view, which is segment. So the segment is the only dimension in the view. The viz level of detail is the segment. And it's both on the rows and on the color. And what I've done here is I've made a meaningless aggregation of that same pill by pulling it out as a discrete aggregate value on the rows next to itself as a dimension. And so this is just a thing that sometimes I do because I need to work with that value as an aggregate level value. And I know that I can wrap it in that minimum aggregation function because the level of detail of canvas is already at the segment level of detail. And so in this case, that meaningless minimum is not modifying the value of the segment at all. It's just simply taking it from a record level value, which is the dimension pill on the left, and putting it into an aggregate level value by wrapping it in that minimum because the viz level of detail or the canvas is able to support that. So I have a one-to-one relationship between the dimensionality of the view and the aggregation that's happening. And I'm just doing that on purpose because I want to treat that min segment as an aggregate value.
Yeah, there's a place where Tableau will do this if you've ever noticed when you drag a dimension onto tooltip. And Tableau wraps it in the adder aggregation. the adder aggregation, if the viz level of detail is sufficiently detailed enough, is effectively a meaningless aggregation.
Mm-hmm. And,
Yep.
and the way that I think about that is because
Mm-hmm.
it's not possible to put a dimension on the tooltip. You can't do it. Why? Because when you bring out a dimension into the canvas, it's going to change the granularity of the canvas and therefore change the number of marks that are on the screen, or potentially change the marks on
Mm-hmm.
the screen. And if the entire premise of the tooltip is to give you a mouse over hover of the marks that are there, then it should be impossible to change the marks that are on the canvas by adding something to the tooltip. And that's the reason why only aggregate values are
Mm-hmm.
allowed on the tooltip.
That's why it's so important to have all of these concepts well defined and well
Yes.
understood
Mm-hmm.
in our brains, because those things are not immediately visible as you're working with the tool. You have to sort of build this image inside your imagination for what's going on in between and behind.
Right, totally. You need a mental model, because otherwise it could be really confusing. Why can't I add a dimension to the tooltip? Well, because, right? Okay, so there's this thing.
Yeah, can I fill in one more thing here?
Yeah.
And this relates to something Robert was saying, you were saying the other day, pointing out is, so segment is and I'll ask people this sometimes, like, what is segment here and what is min segment here? And they'll go, well, that's a dimension, that's a dimension. And the thing is, segment is totally a dimension in that segment field on rows, the segment field on the marks card. There's going to be a segment field in our orders table on the left that is set up as a dimension. Those are all dimensions. The min segment here is a measure.
It's not a dimension.
And Tableau it's not a dimension. It is being used as a measure in the view. And so this goes to this piece of what Robert was just talking about with having these mental models baked or kind of baked into ourselves as we're working with Tableau. Segment is used as a dimension here. Segment is used as a measure here. And the identifier as to where it's being used as a measure is that aggregation keyword on the field.
Yeah. And that's really illustrative of the fact that the canvas is the specification. Your arrangement of pills on the canvas is the specification for the view. And we're going to talk a lot more about precisely that when we come back to the 4 pill types. And the dimension that's a segment here on the left on the rows is a dimension. The very same column of data is a measure just next door. And you could use any combination of the 4 pill types for any field, any number of ways, in order to really define with specificity what you want for the canvas to do.
I'm smirking a little bit because I'm curious about words here. So far, we've been talking about what is an aggregation and defining that term. And I would agree that the min segment here is an aggregation of that dimension. Is it a measure? What makes it a measure? What is it that we are measuring when we call it that?
I kind of have a couple of thoughts on that. So one of them is like I am not a data warehousing person, but in that part of my brain that covers that way, it is not a measure. Because to your thing, we're not really, the closest thing that we're measuring is we're getting what is the minimum of a string value is the first one alphanumerically based on our collation settings. And if collation is a new term to you, it's basically sorting. How do you alphanumerically sort something in your language?
So in this case, it's the very first value in an alphanumeric sort.
And that, by definition, then is aggregation, because we're taking many values and we're summarizing them up, which is a really wonderful segue into this next slide here to say strings can be aggregated like that min of segment. So if we have that very same canvas, but we replace the dimension that's on the rows, what was previously the segment dimension, now with the category, and we add in just the count of records that are in the orders table, both of these are from that orders table, then that's exactly right. That aggregation thing is happening where we're taking 2,000, 6,000, 1,865 records that are in that original data set, and we're summarizing those up to the level of detail of category. And the minimum segment for each of those is consumer, consumer, consumer. And so I can really see the question that you were asking there, Robert, because definitely aggregation is happening because we're taking what was many values and aggregating or summarizing them into a single summary statistic, which is the first alphanumeric sort according to the collation sequence of what you're working with. But Robert's question stands, is it a measure?
And I'd say, just to kind of finish up, my other point is, from Tableau terms, it's a measure. Like the way Tableau does this fundamental, the field we put on the view, each one is classified as a dimension or as a measure and has different impacts for being a dimension or measure. There's a set of properties that go with them. So for example, in Tableau, that category field, we can right click on it and get more sort options. We're going to get more filter options for that category field because it's used as a dimension. We're not going to get that for the min of segment because in Tableau terms, it's a measure.
And this really is the crux of these mental models because we're speaking specifically about mechanically what occurs inside of Tableau, whereas these same vocabulary, dimension and measure, could be used in other tools, in your data warehousing textbook, and it could mean other things in a data warehousing textbook when we're talking about star schemas and data modeling and kind of tool agnostic uses of these terms. But in Tableau, very specifically, dimensions are going to do a group by and give us a unique record and determine the viz level of detail. And a measure in Tableau is going to do this aggregation thing.
Yeah. And what happens to strings, if I take any string field, like segment in this case, and convert that to a measure, Tableau is going to automatically turn that into an aggregation, either as a count or a count distinct.
That's right. So what it means then in Tableau, and we'll build further upon this in the future mental models about the 4 pill types, et cetera, is that dimensions are going to determine the granularity of the view, and measures are going to do this aggregation thing, and they're going to summarize up many values, reduce the dimensionality of the data that we're connecting to, and that summarization is going to happen to the level of detail of the canvas, which is determined by the dimensions. Okay, so now that we're getting deep, right? We're getting in it. You ready to roll your sleeves up?
All right.
As if we haven't already.
Okay, so there's this other thing. I host office hours a lot. And a lot of the office hours that I host are in a manufacturing design context. And people come to me with these scatter plots that have, large volumes of data on them. And they've found this little feature in the analysis menu where you go analysis, aggregate measures, which is turned on by default. And this is a wrench in the system. And I'd like to talk to you guys about this. Okay, so we've got we've got segment again on this canvas, and it's on the color this time. So it's the one dimension in the view. And I've just got a scatter plot of the sum of profit by the sum of sales. And because there's 3 segment members, there's 3 members of the segment dimension, everything that we've just talked about until now has 3 marks on the canvas, 1 mark for each segment, and they're different colors. And folks will come to my office hours and they will have found this thing where they go analysis and they uncheck the aggregate measures checkbox, which is the thing that has Tableau behave in the manner that we've just talked about for the last 15 minutes or so. And the very same canvas, instead of 3 marks, has 1 mark for every record in the underlying data set. And now the two pills that are on the rows and columns are no longer wrapped in that aggregate wrapper thing, but they're
Right.
somehow still being treated as measures when I right click on them and say, is it a measure?
Right.
Mm-hmm. And they look like sales and profit now look like dimensions.
Yeah.
But they're like from the description of, from the sense of if we dragged out sales as a dimension, it would look the same
Right.
as sales with analysis aggregate measures turned off. And I've always thought it's an oversight on Tableau's part to have something that is changing how the view is returning results not visible in the view. It's hidden in a menu item. Because if we treated sale, there's kind of a third option here in this view. So we're using sales and profit as measure, segment as a dimension. We get 3 marks initially. We turn off aggregate measures. We see sales and profit and segment, and we see 10,194 marks. There's a third option, which is sales as a dimension, profit as a dimension, segment as a dimension. And then we'll probably see something on the order of several thousand marks, but not all 10,000 marks that are the 10,000 rows in the data set.
So here's my question is when you uncheck that aggregate measures, and this is good to talk through, does that give me every single record, or does it treat each value sort of as a dimension? So for instance, let's say I have a product that I sell for $100 and that product is sold 3 times. I uncheck that aggregate measures. Am I going to have 3 different dots overlapping each other at that $100?
Yep. So the aggregate measures is going to give you a row for every record. And that's the point I was trying to make with kind of 3 different versions of this view is that sales and profit is a dimension. Everything that's sold for $1,000 would roll up and had a profit of $100 would be 1 mark if they're both dimensions.
Yeah.
If there's 20 of them, we're going to get 20 marks.
So what you just confirmed for me was my suspicion that unchecking that aggregate measures option essentially says, now I want to show every observation that I have made. Every time that I measure a transaction, that gets recorded. That's a record in the database. So my record of this observation of this thing that I measured, each of those observations are now observable on the canvas.
Yep. And that goes back to tidy data and the definition or the etymology of the word record means recording of observations. And I can really see where Jonathan is making a critique of Tableau's product design system here, because this is one location where the arrangement of pills on the canvas is meant to be the specification for the view. And so I should, as a practitioner at all times, be able to visually inspect the arrangement of pills on the canvas and discern what's going on there. But at this moment, it would look like sales and profit are dimensions on the view because aggregate measures has been unchecked, but actually there's still measures and I'm getting only the second of those 3 possible behaviors. And it's just not physically possible to discern what's going on by inspecting the arrangement of pills on the canvas because this particular feature is hidden in a menu.
Yep. I'll point out one place, like my literal most recent experience of this was helping somebody with a map. So if you imagine a map of, let's say Canada, you've got the provinces of Canada on there, and so there's 15, 16 provinces. Sorry, not Canadian. Let's say 16. And so you should be so you're expecting to see 16 marks on your view. And you uncheck at some point analysis aggregate measures. And so you're still, and you have like province on your marks card, you're still seeing 16 marks in the view because all of your thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of rows of data are all drawn at those 16 points on the map.
And they're all stacked behind each other.
And they're all
Yep.
stacked behind each
All of
other.
them.
And you're wondering why I can't see the sum of sales or the sum for them, or why doesn't the size change, or why is it when I hover over them in the tooltip, I only see one mark? It's because they're all stacked on top of one another. So this, one of the ways that I kind of think of this, and this is in, we talk about this in the context of the mental model stuff, is this sort of engineering mode of Tableau, of being clear about, okay, what is it I want to see, and being able to translate that to what does the canvas need to look like? What are the dimensions that I need on the canvas to get the number of marks that I'm expecting to see?
Yeah. And then you specify the arrangement of pills to accomplish just that. And in my world, people come to with these scatter plots, and because they don't understand dimensions and measures and granularity and aggregation, and their ultimate goal was to see one mark on the screen for every observation, and they found this item in the menu. I generally, I'd be curious to hear what you think. I generally encourage people away from using this because of the manner in which it behaves, and instead nudge them towards this engineering mode and say, let's let Tableau behave as it's generally designed to do, because in almost all circumstances, you want for measures to aggregate, and instead take more of an engineering mindset and determine what's the granularity of the canvas that I want to work with, and then let's drag out those specific dimensions.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm with you, Keith, on this one. And this also comes from me doing a lot of office hours and helping people. And it comes from a maintenance piece of, I may build something here that works perfectly, but then who's the person a month from now or 6 months from now who's going to be going back to this view and doing something? And then there's this hidden menu item that got checked, and then I'm forgetting about it. I'm wondering, why isn't this doing what I'm expecting? Why isn't sales acting like a dimension, for example? So the piece I suggest to people, and this goes back to the grain of data mental model, is drag out those dimensions that are going to get you to the grain of your data. So the view is set up to return one record for every observation. And in that case, it's immediately visible because in addition to segment on the marks card, there's row ID or SKU ID or whatever.
Serial number.
Whatever that set of fields is, that's going to get us a record for every observation.
And then I move into, kind of visual analytics and dashboarding, and I've got sophisticated parameter actions and set actions and filter actions. And I want to drive interactivity in order to increase the comprehension and engagement with my dashboard. I actually need those other dimensions to be in the canvas in order to drive those other actions. And so generally, by all means, it should be the rare case, probably for an ad hoc analysis only, that I kind of uncheck this aggregate measures. Almost never.
Yeah.
Yep. Or those cases where we get a data set where there is no set of dimensions that will uniquely identify a record.
Yeah.
That happens.
Okay. So I said we were wrapping up, but I've actually got one more wrench to throw at you guys.
All right.
Okay, so this is an interesting example. We're talking aggregation, right? And there's all of these different ways that we can aggregate. We can take the attribute, the percentile, the variance, the covariance, the standard deviation, the minimum, the maximum. And in fact, I think it would be really fascinating if we could pick them apart, because as I'm about to show, each of them has even more nuanced behaviors that you can kind of leverage and take advantage of in order to further your analysis. For example, this min function. perhaps
Mhm.
not commonly understood. Usually we use minimum like we did with the segment. What's the minimum of the segment, for example? However, it's possible inside of the one min function to give it two arguments.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I can give it
Yeah.
expression 1 and expression 2.
That's right.
And what's really fascinating about this is it's going to take the minimum of the two values that come from the same record in the underlying data set, as opposed to taking the minimum of various records that were each kind of multiple records in the underlying data set. And these two expressions themselves, to Robert's earlier point, could be level of detail expressions that are performed at a completely different granularity than the record or the canvas.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah. Or one use case I've had with them when I'm drawing a chart, and percentages are a really good one because you get percentages and you can have percentages sometimes just blow up into thousands of percent,
Mm-hmm.
or they just get into huge negative numbers or so on. And I've said, okay, I've got a chart and I want the bottom of the axis range, the top of the axis range to be a certain value. So I'm going to go like 0 to 150%. And if it's over 150%, just draw it at 150%. So I can do, so instead of on my columns shelf, for example, if I'm drawing like a horizontal bar chart, instead of putting the measure, let's say it's expression 1, I'll put min expression 1, comma 1.5.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect.
And then if it's anything less than 150%, expression 1 is what's going to get it returned. I'm going to see it perfectly.
Yeah.
And if it turns out to be 190%, that's too much. Expression 2, which is 1.5, is going to be returned, and I get the result.
It's just gonna floor the thing at 150. Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's really a simpler way to write a more lengthy if-then comparison, right? If this value is greater than this, then return this, otherwise return that. This does that in one simple step.
And I'm just fascinated by this difference between measures and aggregation. This is an interesting example of both at the same time, but in different ways, because aggregation is taking multiple values, expression 1 and expression 2, and summarizing them into a single summary statistic. The minimum is behaving as a measure in Tableau, as we've defined this is the way that Tableau measures behave. And yet the comparison of the two values is happening within the same record of the underlying data set, or a level of detail expression would return a record level value. So in this particular case, we're doing this aggregation thing within the same record as opposed to across multiple records, as would normally be the case.
And just one clarification on that, Keith, you were talking about like within a record or using a level of detail expression. This will work totally fine on aggregates and aggregate results as well.
So you could use this in all four levels of calculation.
I can do min of min sales, comma 1.5, and it'll work.
So Keith, what other surprises and wrenches do you have for us here?
That's it.
I know you have something else.
Okay.
That's it. But I think we're hooked, right? Like, who would have thought that we could talk for 45 minutes on on this simple question, what is aggregation, right? And so if you like what we're doing here and you want to get on this crazy train, start at the top of the mental models and keep going with us, because this is number 5 and we've got at least a dozen, maybe up to 15 to go. And each step of the way, we're just gonna ratchet up a little bit further and chase the rabbit a little bit deeper down the hole in order to kind of paint this picture of how does Tableau work. Okay, well, thanks, guys.
Thank you,
that was
Keith.
super fun.
This has been great.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep. Okay, we'll see you next time.
All right.
Bye.
Action Analytics.